Great. Good morning. My name is Kimberly Yannick, and I am with the Center for Social Behavioral Support at Old Dominion University in Virginia. And I'm also a partner with the Center on PBIS. And I'm joined by my entertaining friend and colleague, Dr. Bob Putnam, and I'll let him introduce himself.
Hi, everybody. I'm Executive Vice President of PBS and Consultation at the May Institute, and I've been a national partner with the PBS Center this is going on my 20th year, and have enjoyed working with hundreds of schools around implementing PBS. Learned a lot from all of them, and we're really happy to be here today, Kimberly and myself, to talk about classroom systems. And I'll turn it back over to you, Kimberly.
Okay, and we want to find out who's joining us today. So Austin, our support is going to colleague is going to put up a poll. If you could just indicate really where you are in the education system first. Okay, I see about 40% state. No. Okay. And if you're selecting other, I just would invite you in the chat to perhaps let us know more specifically where you work in the education or mental health system. Okay. All right. So, Bob, it looks about evenly spread around state, district, school, and then another of 33%. Okay.
Okay, cool.
Majority of state leadership here, it looks like. So I'm going to end that poll. And then the second question, if you can use the chat, and thank you all for adding more specific information that helps us in what we focus on in our time together today. If you wouldn't mind just putting your role, I see, thank you, Patty, for putting technical assistance. But if you wouldn't mind dropping your role, thank you, Denise, for putting your role in there where you're joining from. That'll also help Bob and I want to know where to focus. Okay. Thank you, Stephanie. Appreciate that. Chicago teacher moving into PBIS. And please, I hope I'm pronouncing this correctly, Guadalupe. My brother's in Chicago. I hope you're loving it there. Okay. So we're going to go ahead and I'm going to show you the outcomes that Bob and I have designed for today. And then Bob is going to share the most brilliant, an E at the end. Thank you for helping me with that. I love that city too. Thank you, Bryce, District Administrator. Susan, thank you for putting your role as well. We're going to move to the outcomes so we can show you what we've put together today on this really critical component of our work, and that is classroom systems. Really looking at how are we designing a system of support for classroom teachers to implement all the things that we're asking them to do. And so Bob has, if you could just advance us to the outcomes, I'll just review those real quick. And then I can't wait for you to hear the research that Bob and his colleagues have put together and what happens when we focus on this notion of classroom systems. So we're going to start with the end in mind. Like, what would it look like if we were really focusing at that classroom level on classroom practices, data, systems, and then zoom out to kind of look at, okay, this is what it would look like. Here's an example of some research that Bob's going to share on what happens when we put that focus on the systems. And then as you think about scaling at a LEA, SEA level, or even just thinking about designing a support system at each of those levels of the organization, then what could that look like and sound like? So I hope you made popcorn this early in the morning, because I've heard this presentation and I just absolutely love it. It's so exciting to see what Bob has done with this school district. So I'm going to stop talking, Bob, and turn it over to you.
Okay. Thank you, Kimberly. Thank you for putting no pressure on me in terms of what what we want to go over. As I said, I've been involved in school-wide PBS at various levels, from the state level down to the district level, down to the school level, and into the classrooms and on an individual basis. So for me, over the last 5 years, I think the classroom is where it's at, around all a variety of initiatives. If we look at in terms of kind of where the action is, in terms of discipline issues and academic performance, it's in the classroom. So we've done a lot of work with this district, and it's really my team. And I need to give credit to the district folks, because they of what have made this happen. They've bought into classroom as one of the most important things. And so we have gone to look at, in terms of, when we look at the classroom, we're really looking at in terms of high rates of academic engagement. That's really what we focus on. And then look at in terms of what's the simplest practices that we can use to get high rates of academic engagement. And what we aim for is 80%. In the entire school of students involved, in terms of having 80% of the time, if you walk in any classroom, that the students are academically engaged. And one of the reasons we do that is, if they're academically engaged, we have less problem behavior. And on the other hand, one of the stories I always tell is, the kid drops the pencil on the floor. The teacher thinks that he did it on purpose. And from that particular point in time, she scolds him for throwing the pencil on the floor. He says, blank you. She says, get out of my room. And that's our office discipline referral. He goes down to the assistant principal, and the assistant principal says, why are you here? The teacher picked on me, and I'm tired of the school, and blank you as well. And the assistant principal says, you're out of here. I'm going to suspend you for 3 days for inappropriate behavior. So that's so that's what you might see as well in terms of that. And so our goal is really, to the extent that basically we really can implement PBS practices in the classroom, we have a much better chance in terms of having kids on task and in the classroom learning. If you have a really good academic curriculum that you're doing with fidelity, if they're in class and on task and have access to that we're going to get much better academic outcomes, as well as social emotional outcomes. So we have been involved with this district, the Gardner Public Schools, for probably about 12 years, really, as senior behavioral analysts, as working with those students at the very tip of the triangle who may be at risk for a more restricted placement. And since about September of 2020, we've gone in and really done intensive work with them around building up their PBS systems, both at Tier 1, at Tier 2, and Tier 3, and most importantly, in the classroom. And this wouldn't have happened without the superintendent, Mark Pellegrino, and Joyce West, and Amber Casavan, who were involved. And so they were looking at this also as a 3 to 5 year process in terms of moving to get fidelity across the tiers. All right, so this is the signature, excuse me, of the superintendent. And the superintendent really means this, that positive relationships. And so really, when we're looking at classroom PBS practices, is really building relationships, right, with kids. And we're really looking at both academic rigor and in terms of social emotional practices with rigor, which means fidelity for every child in every classroom every day. So he really means this. When he does his walkthroughs, that's what he's looking for. So you might want to say, who are these folks? They're located up in north central Massachusetts. It's a small district. They have 2,400 kids. It's 4 schools that they have. It used to be 5 last year, but they combined their elementary schools together, so they're PK to 4. And oftentimes when I do this presentation, the bigger districts saying, well, would this work in my district? My district is really big. And what we say is you really want to start off with a cohort model, which is what we've done here. We started with one school and then built from there. And if you're in a bigger district or in a state that, and we usually try to look at is work with the willing. So we're really looking at in terms of those schools that, particularly at the principal level, that are interested in terms of making some improvements along with the superintendent. And they have on high needs districts, 70% of their students have high needs. 22%, which is way above the national average, have students with disabilities. But in Massachusetts, the average is 18%, but they're still above. And then you can see 61% of the students are white, and the rest of them are various racial makeup. So why the need for district? What was the problem? So they were in a constant reactive mode of what we call firefighter mode, that they were intervening individually, not really as a well-coordinated team, which is when we look at PBS, where they've really done a great job integrating as a team. There were constant walkie-talkie calls, tying up the administrator and the counselors and the BCBAs. And oftentimes when I work with principals, I tell them my goal is to get you to have your lunch when you want it without being interrupted, right? And this principal, that wasn't the case at all, right? So it was a dysfunctional system that we don't have time to do that, right? Which was from the district's perspective, we got to do something different, right? So this is the Swiss data. And so you can see this is an elementary school. They're one of their elementary schools that if you look at the comparison in terms of the other 3,000 elementary schools in Swiss, this school, that top line there is the 75th percentile. And so you can see they're way, way, way above the 75th percentile. So the district initially said, well, can you send us more BCBAs? And we said, no, this is a systems problem. We need to work on it from a systems perspective. And they're also their referrals to special ed, right? We're way up. And one of the things they really wanted to do is kind of what's special about special ed is they wanted to really work out a system that would have students be successful without necessarily needing special education services. All right. So I'm just going to do a quick preview that they saw fidelity of implementation across all tiers. They also had did the self-assessment survey, which is the staff perception of that, which they again showed improvements. They looked at school climate survey and showed improvements at all across. They showed exclusionary discipline for ODRs, suspensions, restraints for all students, but those students particularly with students with disabilities and across the board in terms of racial ethnicity groups, they saw improvements as well. They saw improvements in attendance. They saw improvements in tier 2 and tier 3 effectiveness, particularly if you look at office discipline referrals. And they saw increased inclusion rates, increased graduation rates, reduced dropout rates, reduced special education referrals, fewer SST referrals for social emotional behavior. That wasn't the same for academics, and we're beginning to work with them around. And as I said, reduced ODRs. So if you have questions, Kimberly's manning the chat. So we'll monitor that. And if you have questions, feel free to, because we had a small group here. So when I say we, it's, how did the district do this? What did they do to get these outcomes? So they really focused on tier 1 at the classroom level, that they looked at their data and said, what most of what we're seeing is basically office discipline referrals, which means students are not in class and on task. Are occurring there. So that's why they began to focus at the classroom level. And, the teachers, my wife was a teacher for 38 years. Teachers don't get a lot of credit. and they're dealing with challenges every single day. And the goal is really to equip them with the right supports in their classrooms, at all classrooms, including the classrooms that are substantially separate or the segregated classrooms that serve students with disabilities. Right? And one of the goals was, could we prevent the need for more intensive supports, right? If we could build better classroom supports, and you'll see the data for that as well, that they actually reduced the number of students that needed tier 2 and tier 3 supports. So they went from that firefighting mode to, after they put this in place, the mental health staff on the BCBA could get together 3 times a week for a half an hour to 45 minutes before school and problem solve around the students who needed tier 3 services, as well as other students, whereas basically they were just running around fighting fires before. So why did they focus on the classrooms? This is across the district on the bottom left hand, and you can see huge, that almost 100% as compared to hallways, cafeterias, others. They also saw out of bounds cutting classes, where besides disciplinary referrals that we saw, and their goal is to get more kids in class and on task. And this is their ODRs by all schools in the district in fall, and you can see where they stand, which is above the 75th percentile. Compared to the national data, and our goal was really get down below that. All right. So this was the district outcome goal after we began talking about the classroom support system, was to increase student engagement in classrooms as measured through a 25 reduction in ODRs for each school by June 2023. And that the goal was really to use evidence-based interventions with fidelity in classrooms, but across all the locations. And that we really wanted to look at in terms of implementing a classroom support system that would get them high rates of engagement and reduce their office disciplinary referrals. So the goal was, can we ensure that basic PBS Tier 1 classroom practices were in place? Walkthroughs to measure fidelity. We actually taught them how to do a quick 10-minute observation to really look at the whether the classroom, which we'll talk in a minute, classroom practices are really in place. But the first thing is on a school-wide basis, that are there school-wide positive behavior expectations posted? Are the expectations taught to fluency? Do we have an acknowledgement system that's really being distributed? So this was the first level in terms of looking at all the classrooms that, did all the classrooms have those posted? Were they taught to fluency, and really was the acknowledgement system being used that they had designed? Right? And as I said before, they were looking at all classrooms, so including the substantially separate classrooms. Right, so these are what we would consider, from the research, it would be what are the high leverage classroom behavior support practices. And none of this is probably surprising to you. So one is we would like to have high rates, particularly in whole groups, of 80% of instruction going on. That we want to have a praise to error correction, so that the research indicates, you probably heard, 4 to 5 to 1. But the more recent research is 9 to 1, where you look at it in classrooms with students with disabilities that are at risk for emotional behavior disorders, that you'd want a ratio of 9 to 1, right? And then we would want to see proactive monitoring or active supervision, where the teacher is moving around and rather than teaching to the board or teaching to one kid. And then really we're looking at high rates of opportunities to respond, which would probably be 30% of the time that students would have an opportunity to respond. So we really had to teach people these practices, and they did in terms of that. And the goal was really to maximize on-task behavior build student-teacher relationships as well as academic performance. And when I've talked to people in the equity world or in the mental health world, in the trauma world, they say, these are really what we're looking for in terms of practices that cut across all those different initiatives. And actually, when I did the presentation, the superintendent came up to me and said, I can't believe you distilled this to 4 behaviors. And all of these behaviors really cut across all the different initiatives that we're trying to do. We're really trying to build better teacher-student-teacher relationships. We'll show you some equity data as well. So that's been their focus. They've said, okay, this is what we're going to do in terms of doing this. So it's easier to say it. Then the question is actually doing it, right? So that's where we help support them. So the way we do this is, we work with the administration in terms of saying, okay, do you buy into this, and in terms of what it is, and we have a PowerPoint that goes over the actual research that is there and shows that both the administration and the teachers graphs from the research that shows this, so that they have a foundation in terms of what works. And we always tell them, we don't care in some ways what you do. We just want to get kids up to 80% of academic engagement. So if you have your own strategies to do that and you can get them up to 80% academic engagement, that's great. And actually, when we do our observation and we look at those 4 different behaviors, we say any one of these behaviors will help to get your students up to higher levels of academic engagement. It's your choice in terms of kind of what do you want to do in terms of that. And then we've had a classroom observation tool that looks at these high leverage community classroom behaviors practices. It's 10-minute observation, 15-minute partial interval, which we look at the teacher and we look at in terms of the teacher. Are they in that 15-second interval? Are they engaging in instruction? Have they engaged in any acknowledgement, any error correction, opportunities to respond, right, or active supervision? And then in the next 15-second, we look at that student 1, and we're looking at on task or off task. And then we go back to the teacher for the next 15-second interval, and then to student 2. And we usually build a rubric that goes around the classroom in terms of so we're not just looking at one kid who has the best behavior or may have the worst behavior in the class. And then basically from the tool, we graph that up and for performance feedback to the instructional staff. So what we did was train really all the mental health staff in the school in terms of these practices, how to do the observation tool. And so that they, rather than just responding, they could go and look at in terms of how can I help coach you in terms of using these practices. Now, one of the things for buy-in is one of the issues we find is people say, wait a minute, this looks like an evaluation, and only the administrators in our school district can evaluate teachers. So we say this is really only by the behavioral coaches, and Gardner now they have their instructional coaches using the same system. Because if it's tied to the evaluation system, the union's going to say no, you can't do that. So we have strongly said this is between the coach and the teacher. This is not to be shared with the administrator. And if I get tied down to the stake and I'm lit on fire, there's no way I'm going to disclose this to my administrator. So it really is instructional support, behavior support, right? And that we do our observations only at preferred times. So if teacher says, this is not a good time, we come back at another time. There's so the big thing is no surprises. And then when we provide the feedback, because when I ask people, does anybody like to be observed? I never get a hand go up. So the goal is really training the mental health staff and the behavior support staff how to provide positive feedback. Even if it's just one Acknowledgement, well, nice job. We got one acknowledgement. So it's really working with people in terms of emphasizing the positives. And the nice thing about the precise feedback is if it goes from 1 to 2, we can really go, terrific job, we're getting better, right? But the focus again is on academic engagement. So this is one of the initial observations that we did, and we moved away from observations to say it's a classroom support system. So the gray is pre, and this is a 15-year veteran with about 45 minutes of professional development. She went from go over to the right-hand side. She went from less than 60% on task, which means 40% of the time the kids are not on task, which means we're going to get a lot of behavior problems. And within 45 minutes, she went up to 80%, which is our goal. And you can see how the praise to behavior correction was less than 1-to-1 and went up to 2.5. So our experience with most teachers, some teachers just get it when we do the didactic presentation. But, just like we'd look at a triangle, we have some teachers that will get it along those lines. Some teachers already have it. We've gone into classrooms where, teachers have kids on task 80% and have high rates to praise the behavior correction. But in most cases, when we see somebody struggling, it's because they don't really engage in these practices. So you can see the praise went way up to 2.5-to-1 and active super to 1. And in this case, we didn't collect opportunities to respond. So that there wasn't a gray bar there. Right? And this is another teacher who was struggling as well. And so you can see on task. So this is about an hour, maybe in 15 minutes. 15-year teacher. I wish I knew this when I first started. This has made my life a whole lot easier. So you can see her praise was like 1 to 8. And within that period, and the performance feedback is, from our perspective, is really important because we do this and everybody says, oh yeah, I praise all the time. My kids are always on task, right? So that really helps a lot in terms of that. And it's a very simple measure, 10 minutes in terms of that. And you can see active supervision went up, opportunities to respond went up. And most importantly, we're looking at on-task behavior has gone up above 80%. So just if you're looking at this, one thing we learned, it was observation was a trigger for anxiety for some teachers. So we really, one question was, how are they being identified for these observations? The union started getting involved. So, we went upon no surprises. And actually, we had data like this because the union would complain to the superintendent is, you got to do something about these kids with these behaviors. Well, he took the data that we just showed and some other data and went back to him and said, hey, this is what we're doing. Right. And, they got on board as well. All right, so we changed it to classroom support system. So we trained up the district PBS person on this. Then we trained up the instructional coaches. All the mental health staff were trained up so that they could really look at in terms of doing the observations. And the biggest thing is really to make sure that we're presenting this positively, that there's no surprises, right? And then the districts went from that one school to say, we're going to do this in every single school with our 250 teachers from pre-K to high school. And so that's they're in process at this particular point in time. They built district-wide process and procedures. That again was reviewed by all the administrators in terms of what that is, and as well was reviewed with the union to make sure that everybody was. And so it went all the way up to the top in terms of the process. Kimberly, do we have any questions? No? Okay. All right. Cool. All right. So then we and they built the procedures that are district-wide, that kind of wider focus on the classrooms that could be distributed to every single staff in the district. Why focus? What's the purpose? Who receives the PD? How long does it take? Who conducts the professional development? And so we've done it from the outside, doing the professional development to the faculty, because they felt there would be more buy-in if we did it rather than them. But certainly you can do that. I always think of one of my staff who we do outside technical assistants who went to a school district, and she said my IQ dropped 30 points because I work for the school district. So sometimes it's worthwhile to have an outside person that comes in to be able to, but certainly this could be done within your own state or district in terms of that. And one of the questions is, what's the criteria? So as I mentioned before, once they got this established, they basically looked at any classroom that had a student that was going to be referred for tier 2, or if in fact they showed up on a mental health screener. They wanted to make sure that the classroom was supportive and that the student was in a classroom that had high rates of acknowledgement and high rates of opportunity to respond. So they were checking that out. And if in fact that wasn't, then they worked on it in terms of how do we support the teacher in terms of getting higher rates of academic engagement, right? And then there was a question is, can the administrator request that I, and they could, but they wouldn't, the data wouldn't be shared with them, right? So it was really trying to make it really clear to people in terms of what the procedures were, so that there wouldn't be any pushback because people didn't understand that. Right.
Can I interrupt for a moment with a question?
Yeah.
So can you tell us how the data for the classroom visits observations was recorded, and how was it? Was there a platform you used? Was it paper, pencil? Did you use a system to analyze?
So we, well, let me go first before that. One of the things I find a lot is when we look at the system and we look at the observation is, well, is this valid in our school? So usually what we've gone in is asked the principal or whoever kind of one of the senior people might be, and it might be the PBS coach or whatever. Can you nominate without telling us names? A couple teachers who basically you think have good classroom management practices, and on the other hand, a couple teachers who do not, and let us go and do a 10-minute observation, and we'll come back and see if we can match up with your opinion. And it always happens, right? That basically, in this school, we had a teacher right off the bat at 7-1 and had like 90% on task behavior. And those two other teachers I just showed you were the two teachers that were identified that had challenges. So, Kimberly, to get you a question, which is a great question, we built an Excel spreadsheet that the school used to put the data in and automatically generate the graphs. It's a pretty simple tool that we use that will generate the graphs for whoever the instructional behavior support person would be to review with the staff. We also go over those graphs in terms of what a graph should look like. If it's, if people are doing a great job, which means, again, they have high rates of on-task behavior. And then we look at, a 5-to-1 ratio in terms of this is what this looks like at the graph. So there's some comparison. This is the data we're going to get. This is a good one in terms of high rates of on-task behavior. And then we go back out after we've graphed it, which takes about another 5 minutes in terms of doing that back out. They go back out to look at in terms of providing performance feedback with the staff. Is that clear? And somebody else could build something probably more. I'm not that tech savvy, but I know there are other people on this call that probably are more that could build something else, but that's the way we've done it. And so when we went in, we did Train the Trainer Day, which is training all the responders, right, in terms of this. We didn't train the administration, but they knew what was going on. So we reviewed the observations, the tool, the operational definitions, because we have clear operational. So first starting off, it's sometimes it's a little challenging because 15 seconds goes by really fast. but with some fluency. And then we really looked at developing IOA with all these folks. So if I went in and somebody else went in, that we have IOA rather than Bob's an easy marker and Kimberly's a tough marker, but it's probably be the other way around. And then taught people how to debrief, how to put the scores into the graphing templates, and then to debrief and do a good role play with the teacher feedback using the performance feedback graphs. All right. So we really looked at that. They used the common planning time to replicate it with other mental health staff across the district. In preschool, there were some changes to the definitions because, we're looking at play in a lot of cases is not sitting down for academic work. And then, we developed a rollout plan with all principals to ensure that all mental health staff at least have one observation before the end of that first year. Right. So this is a comparison of some of the classrooms, fall versus winter. And so you can see on the third grade student with a classroom with an inclusion classroom, they had pretty high rates of on-task behavior. You can see 95%, the graph on the left, and you can see their behavior correction. This is we just got this to 1-to-1, but before it was 3 with no. I'm sorry, I'm reading the wrong ones. Right, that we were looking at 45% praise to behavior correction. So that was about a 1.5, and you see the next one went from 3 to 1. So and then this is the next one, and so it took us 4 observations to get to 75%, and you can see the praise to behavior correction was went way up from the beginning, and opportunity to respond went up as well. And then there's another one on the right hand side that we're looking at again, praise to behavior correction as well. So what they did, and this was without our suggestion, is they actually said, this is a school with 1,000 kids, 50 teachers. They said, we really want to use this as a screener for every single classroom, right? Included their integrated preschool classrooms that they looked at and said that this is really worthwhile as a screener to be able to look at where we're at across the 50 teachers. And so in the fall, they actually screened every single classroom, the 50 teachers, with the observation, because really they're looking at this as at the systems level is potentially saying, where do we need to intervene to really look at improving our academic engagement, right? And so, as I said, they came up with developmentally appropriate definitions for on task. In their integrated preschool and also students with ASD. Right? And then so all schools were trained with trainers at each school. So probably there were 50 mental health and behavior support staff that were trained in this. And this district is really very progressive as well, as they've trained. We've helped them train all their mental health staff and doing brief functional behavioral assessments to free up the BCBAs to be able to do more intensive FBAs and BIP with better fidelity, with all their high students who need tier 3. Right. So this is the graph of the colors mean, if you look at the top right hand side, this is pre-K, it's blue. Kind of red is kindergarten, yellow is first grade, green is second grade, kind of the red is orange is third grade, light blue is fourth grade, a little darker blue, and middle is sub-separate. And so you can see the yellow is the building average and the green is the goal, right? So you can see their goal, which is the last, if you go on the on-task behavior, their goal is basically to look at, get to get to 80%, and they're pretty close in what their goal was. And you can see with certain grades, they beat the goal in terms of that. Other grades that they were looking at. So I think it looked like fourth grade was kind of the most challenging in terms of on-task behavior. And then they looked at praise. And again, it's 4-to-1, 0.5 to 0.5 to 0.5. And you can see their praise to error correction. And most of them, they were above what we would call 1-to-1, but in some cases not. So this was fall. We haven't got the data back from spring yet. But you could see some of the data above was where we've done some preliminary work in terms of collecting that information. But I believe they're in the process of analyzing all the information with us in terms of looking at the comparison between the spring and the fall. So, and the goal is really to build sustainable systems. So it's really building in that system. So their tier 1 team, when they have somebody that they can identify for tier 2, would go and do the observation to make sure that the appropriate PBS classroom practices are in place. And they do this both on the classroom, and then they do it for the individual kids to make sure that they're getting, that high rates of acknowledgement to error correction and high rates of academic engagement. Right. So this is some of the data. This is just for major office discipline referrals for students with disabilities. And so you can see in October, they had a rate of 169 total major office discipline referrals. This is total. And you can see for April, May, and June, it went to 7, 23, and 16. So probably an average somewhere in around 15. So that was huge. And they really have made some really nice changes looking across the students with disabilities. And this is all students with disabilities, whether they're in general education classrooms or segregated classrooms. Right. This is basically looking at the racial information, and this is looking at the beginning of the year to the first third of the year versus the second third of the year. And so you can see Black went from 97% decrease, and Asian had a 37%. There's one American Indian in the school, and you can see he is up. Right? And Hispanic Latino is up a little bit, but every other group, even the white kids, basically have shown decreases in terms of their risk ratio. And if you don't know risk ratio, basically we're looking at what's the risk compared to the norm group of somebody getting an office disciplinary referral. And so usually if you look at our state, it's about 3. And you can see, but this district is much more stringent. They're saying 1.5 is what they're aiming for. All right. So this is over five years. And so you can see an 84% decrease in Black, a 48% decrease in Asian, 36% in Hispanic, 2% in white. There is a 13% increase in multiracial. And they look at this information regularly to kind of figure out what we can do and use Kent McIntosh's equity interventions that in terms of moving forward. This is their suspensions in the school, 37% decrease. We also looked at, I don't see this slide in here, but I have another, the PBS Center requires us to put a triangle in our presentations, as Kimberly knows. So usually the triangle that usually proceeds before this went from, they had 9% of their kids who had 6 or more, which we would say is needs tier 3. And with the system in place, they went to 2%. So they went from about 40 kids who had 6 or more to about 8 kids that had 6 or more. And Susan Barrett, who I think is on this call, and Terry Scott did a really awesome research study that looked at in terms of 20 instructional minutes per loss per ODR. So they picked up about 25.5 instructional days. And this is through January as compared to, I think, January, because this is kind of pre-COVID. And the administrators picked up 12.75 administrative days. I don't know whether they sat in their office drinking coffee and eating bonbons with those 13 extra days, but they picked up those days. So, and then we've also looked at tier 2 and tier 3 effectiveness data, right? So on the left-hand side is tier 2, and you can see this is as of March 23rd, that 60% of them were of the individuals in tier 2 were making progress. Looking at office discipline referrals, 24% were coming in. There was about 5% ready to graduate and about 12%. So they've looked at this to say, how quickly can we get our kids into tier 2? They tracked in terms of how the kids making progress and problem solved in terms of what they could do, and then particularly looked at the students who are not making progress is check in, check out with Fidelity. Do they have access to this small social skills group that would work on what particular areas that they would have? And then this is tier 3 as much, and you can see 75% of the students in tier 3 were making progress. About 70% were ready to fade. There was 4.2. So I think that's like 1 of the students not making progress. And, so the goal in this with them, they meet regularly, like twice a month to look at this. Is they're really looking at how do we fade? Because in a lot of schools, once they go into tier 2 services, they never come out, and they're really pushing to look at fading kids so that they really, if they take new kids in, that they really can do them justice. All right. So this is, what they got for 8.1% are currently receiving tier 2 supports. 6 have graduated, have been faded out. 3.2 are currently receiving tier 3 supports. So if you look at between tier 1 and tier 2, they have about 11% of their kids are receiving tier 2 and tier 3. And you can see from that graph, they're making progress. And that little yellow thing, 78% of the students receiving tier 2, above 80% success on check in, check out. So they really track this really closely, and they really focus on the classroom stuff to make sure that the kids are being supported in their classroom, and then get a chance to really focus on, the particular tier 2 intervention. This is a school-wide dropout rate. So on the left is the blue is Gardner, and the red is our state average. So they were at 9.9% as compared to the state average of 3 in 2019. They dropped to 6.2 right now in 21. They were below the state average. They were way 3 times the state average, and now they're below the state average. Like the 5-year graduation rate, 19, they were below the state average. 20, they were still below. They're now above the state average in terms of that. All right. They initial referrals to special ed. You can see students referred went from 66 to now 31 and 30 with found eligible. They had 11 students that are found eligible. And it's not like they're not getting services, because they have a well-developed tiered approach. So the kids are getting supports in terms of that. And they're not having parents complain that, well, how come my kid was not found eligible for special ed, because they really lay out what the services the kids are going to get without special ed. I think this is really neat, because I don't know in your state or your district that teacher retention is a real problem, and has been exacerbated during COVID. But they were below the state average, which is red, and you can see they're now above the state average. So we think this is really impacting on teachers feeling good about themselves, because that's really important. If teachers are well, then students are going to be most case well, and so we really are focused on wellness. Right. And we've really focused on the F word. We all know the F word in PBS, which is fidelity. So, it really needs to be supported to be really successful, it needs to be supported by the district. The school, they happen to have an awesome superintendent to do this. We have done tiered fidelity inventories to really measure, and they really track that. They have action plans. One of the things when we first started out, the superintendent in the school said, I want these MTS, PBS teams to meet weekly and review data, which meant mental health, BCBAs, anyone that, is involved in supporting students outside the classrooms or classroom teachers. So they, and then when COVID hit, I said, well, like a lot of our school districts just basically said, we can't do this. He said, no, you're going to keep moving. You're going to keep meeting weekly and look at that. So that really has been one of the things that I think has really pushed this forward is that they're meeting weekly. They're problem solving in terms of what can we do to improve. And when I say weekly, it's like 1 week it might be tier 1, the next week it would be tier 2, and maybe the 2 other weeks it's tier 3, or it's tier 2, tier 3. So, but they're looking at their systems and looking at a way that they can continue to see who's a responder and who's not, whether it's a classroom or whether it's an individual kid or whether it's a certain group. All right. So some of the things we've suggested, and I think we've got some time, right, for questions. Oh, we got about 8 minutes. Okay, so they've looked at to resource map and plan to de-implement practices that are not evidence-based, so no longer necessary. So they've really decided. So they've really looked at, what can we do to make this simpler for people? And as I said, the superintendent saying, Bob, it's 4 behaviors. That's really what we want to focus on, right? And, to identify their high leverage practices, to really look at PD and coaching for both the schools and districts. We work with them really standardizing the PD resources around prioritized high leverage practices. So this is kind of what they and we have done together to really help them in terms of building a better system that works for teachers and for students. We've just done a study. We're just finishing up on looking at tier 3. They have tier 3 in place, but we've looked at in terms of really can it be done with higher levels of fidelity, and so we kind of have a research study that we've done with 10 kids that are in kind of more looking at fidelity in terms of classroom and individual behavior support as compared to practices as usual in terms of tier 3. The group that was in the kind of the more intensified, which didn't mean really, it was more systems than it was more practices, had 380, this is of 10 kids, 380 office discipline referral reduction from spring to beginning of the year to the end of the year. That the tier 3 treatment as usual had 10 kids at a reduction of 3. So we're really excited about that because one of the things is this is one way you get more time, right? And I know when I ask this question, say anybody have any extra time? Hardly anybody ever raises a hand, right? So this was a focus as well as getting time back, and then as well, how do we support teachers? And on the other hand is how do we support students so they have a better social emotional skills as well as academic performance. So I'm going to stop talking because I've done a lot of talking and see if there are any questions.
Thank you, Bob. I've been watching the chat, taking notes. Any questions or other considerations at either state and or district level in terms of how you're currently or how you're thinking about organizing for systems of support for classroom? I know wait time's not one of your high leverage practices, Bob, but I'm going to practice it. Okay, so I don't know if you can see the chat, but Susan is just like I was, just super excited. Such great work. Around capacity, did you train support teachers so they could observe each other? I heard you talk about the BCBAs, but not sure if you train teachers.
So we would train any teacher that was interested. That wasn't something that was kind of off the package because we didn't want to take teachers away from instruction. But anyone who was interested, they would be part of what we would offer. So it wasn't like they were excluded. It was just we were focused on those people that would have kind of more time to support teachers rather than necessarily teach. But I think that's awesome, Susan, in terms of doing that. There's no reason why you can't do this with peers. And in terms of that, that wasn't kind of, but my guess at this point in time is most of the teachers know what the practices, know how it is, so they certainly could support each other. And so that would be, I think, another way to do this. I think the question is they built a routine and a schedule around this. So it would be, okay, how do we have teachers take time out of their instructional time to do this? But I think that's awesome in terms of doing. They have what they call teacher leaders. And so some of the teacher leaders have been involved in the process as well.
Yeah. And Bob, I could see easily at the state level, if you have trainers and or coaches working with the LEA, that you partner up and do that shadowing routine and the IOA process, and same thing with district to school. We always gave choice, like how would you like to have this observation, this visit recorded for school-wide data purposes? Yeah.
Yeah, I think choice is huge. The goal on our end is no surprises, right? And, when's a good time? And several times ago, well, this is not a good time. Well, okay. It might have been a little chaotic in that time in the room at that point in time, or it just wasn't a good time. So we'll come back at another time. Just let us know. So it was really building in, and even building in choice in terms of which of these high level practices do you want to work on, right? In terms of that. And when I just remember one of the first observations, we did the didactic training and then went back to observe the teacher, and I looked at the person who I said, this is not going well. We're going to stop and do a little bit more didactic practices, and maybe even a little bit of role playing, because we want to improve her performance, and it wasn't going to be improved, and we really want to reinforce appropriate behavior or good behavior. It doesn't have to be a whole lot when you're using, the observation, because literally you have 20 observation 15-second intervals with the teacher, and you have 20 kids. So, even if you go from 1 out of 20 to 2 out of 20, you still have a way to be able to say nice work in terms of this. So it's the goal is to move away from I'm catching you being bad to I really want to catch you being good. So.
And there's just a couple of, I'm trying to do some of the follow-up in the chat. Okay. Yes. So have you done any work in this last 30 seconds with using teacher prediction? Sometimes we'll say, what do you think your rates of praise to correction are? You just go in and do the observation.
Yeah, because when we've done it, almost everybody says, I praise a lot. Right. I very rarely find somebody who says, I don't. So my preferences is not to go and say I praise a lot when they've committed that, and then I go back and say, well, you're not. There's some discordance, and it's better off, I think, to say this is what it is. Somebody could try that. I'm just my preference is to catch them. Great, this is what you're doing, rather than, well, no, your prediction was way off.
Yeah. Okay. Well, Bob, once again, I am just excited. I've got a little bolt of energy around the work every time I hear you present this. I thank you so much for sharing it so openly with us so we can learn from this experience. And thank you to everyone for joining. It was lovely to see your name show up. And I think things will be posted, Austin said, on the pbis.org website.
And I want to thank the district because they did all the work. We just gave them some ideas and they really did all the work. In terms of all the great data. That's why you can see they love to present. Thank you, everybody.
Bye, everyone. Thank you.